It wasn't the toast that went cold. It was the way my daughter folded her napkin. Perfectly square. Aligned with the salad fork. Like a curtain quietly closing on a chapter one didn't know had ended. Sunday brunch was always our thing. My little tradition. I'd wake early, make cinnamon rolls from scratch, hum old soul songs while the dough rose. They'd arrive by 11. Bree and Carter, my only daughter and her husband, and their son, Theo, age 6, who still called my creaky backyard the forest. But that morning, everything was off. The kind of off that hums beneath conversation, like a low battery warning you ignore until the screen goes black. I had just poured the last of the orange juice when Bree reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a small envelope. Plain white. No logo. No return address. Just a name scribbled across the front. Mom. I set the picture down. The table rattled slightly. What's this? I asked, keeping my voice light. Carter shifted in his seat, suddenly very interested in his grapefruit halves. Bree didn't answer right away. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way she did when rehearsing hard truths. Theo was chasing blueberries across his plate with a spoon. Only child innocence. Oblivious joy. Bree finally spoke. I think it's time we discuss the next phase, Mom. For your living situation. The words landed like broken glass inside my ribcage. Shiny. Sharp. Unexpected. My living situation? I echoed. You've been in the main house since Dad passed, she said, as if reciting a line someone else had written for her. And we just think it makes sense to downsize. Simplify. The words sounded rehearsed. Not cruel, but not kind either. Just hollow. A deal closed before the meeting even started. I opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed. A transition agreement, they called it. Not a lease. Not a notice. Just a suggestion. It proposed that I relocate to the detached in-law unit behind the house. The one we used to store old furniture and seasonal decorations. The one with the damp ceiling and no insulation.
It was written like a real estate pitch.
Charming guest suite with ample privacy and garden views. Garden views. I planted that garden. Bree, I said, my voice threading between hurt and composure. This is my home. She nodded like she expected this. It still is. Just in a more manageable way. For everyone. I looked at Carter, who refused to meet my eyes. I looked at Theo, who giggled as he smeared jam on his shirt. And then I looked down at the contract. They hadn't even signed it. Just left a blank line for me at the bottom. I see, I said quietly. No one said anything after that. Not really. Just soft murmurs about long-term care planning and thinking ahead. And then Bree folded her napkin again, even tighter, like she was packing away guilt. They stayed for another half hour, eating food I'd made while gently evicting me with paper smiles. Then they left. Theo kissed my cheek and said, I like your house, Grandma. I smiled. Me too, baby. As the door closed behind them, I sat alone in the dining room. The contract still on the table. The cinnamon rolls untouched. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I stood, walked to the sideboard, and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, under a stack of old calendars and ribbon, was a folder. Cream-colored.
Thick.
Inside was the original deed. Signed in 1986. Ruth Montgomery. Sole owner. No joint clause. No succession. No shared interest. Because after my husband died in a boating accident in 1998, I never changed it.
Never needed to.
It was always understood. Until now. I pulled out a pen and wrote 3 words across the front of the agreement Bree had left me. Proposal declined. Respectfully. I folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into their mailbox the next morning. No note. No explanation. Just the return of their assumption. By noon, Bree had texted, Can we talk? I didn't respond. Not yet. I had some talking of my own to do first. But not with her. With a lawyer. With the city planning office. With a contractor I once hired to renovate the kitchen and who owed me a favor. Because if Bree wanted to simplify things, I would too. But not the way she imagined. They wanted to minimize me. But what they didn't know, what they had clearly forgotten, was that this home, this land, this life was built by a woman who once worked 2 jobs while nursing a baby at midnight, who buried a husband and still made every birthday cake from scratch, who paid off the mortgage early and never missed a property tax deadline. And that woman? She had just decided to remember herself again. Before we continue, take a moment to let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to more powerful stories like this one. I didn't respond to Bree's text. Not out of spite, out of strategy. The thing about silence is it makes people nervous. It makes them guess. And I'd spent far too many years being the one doing all the explaining. So I let her wait. That Monday morning, I drove into town. Not to shop, not to escape, but to remember. First stop, the county recorder's office. The building hadn't changed since the 90s. Same chipped linoleum floors. Same dusty fern by the check-in desk. The woman behind the counter wore glasses with leopard print frames and a tired smile. "Can I help you?" "Yes," I said, pulling out my folder. "I'd like a certified copy of my property deed. And while we're at it, I want to update the official mailing address on file." She took the papers, flipped through them, and raised her eyebrows. "Still under your name?" "Always has been." She nodded, made a few clicks on her keyboard, then slid a form toward me. "Just sign here." I did, with a steady hand. No hesitation. By the time I walked out of the building, the address on record was no longer the main mailbox shared with Bree and Carter. It was now a private P.O. box I had rented that morning. Step 1, complete. Next stop was the little law office on Main Street, sandwiched between the flower shop and a cafe that served espresso far too bitter for my taste. The receptionist remembered me. "Ruth Montgomery," she said, peeking over her glasses. "You helped organize the Neighborhood Relief Fund back in 2013, didn't you?" "That was me," I smiled. "And now I'm organizing something else." Quietly. Within 15 minutes, I was seated in a small office with a kind-eyed man named Harris Denton, gray hair, gold watch, and a voice like gravel smoothed by time. "What can I do for you, Ms. Montgomery?" he asked. I pulled out the envelope Bree had given me and placed it on his desk. He skimmed it, snorted. "They trying to shuffle you into the guest shed?" "Something like that," I said. "But I'm not here to sue them or argue. I want to protect myself." Quietly, firmly. Harris leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers together. "Then we start with 2 things. 1, a declaration of property intent. Legal notice that you are the sole owner and have no intention of transferring title. And 2, a formal occupancy agreement, binding terms, just in case they get creative again." I nodded. "And what if I want to start charging them rent?" He grinned. "Then we'll make it airtight." We spent the next hour drafting documents. Nothing aggressive, nothing loud, just boundaries written in ink. I left the office lighter than I'd arrived. By the time I returned home, the sky had turned dusky pink. The kind of sky that makes you believe endings don't have to be ugly. Bree's car was already in the driveway. She was sitting on the porch swing, legs crossed, phone in hand, lips tight. When she saw me, she stood immediately. "Mom, we need to talk." "Then talk," I said, unlocking the front door. She followed me inside like a shadow with heels. "I got your note." It wasn't a note. It was a return of property. "Okay," she said, taking a breath. "Look, maybe we came across wrong. But this isn't about pushing you out. It's about planning for the future." "Planning whose future?" I asked, setting down my keys. "Because it sounds like mine was planned for me." She winced. "You've had a good run in the main house," she offered. "But Carter and I need more space. For Theo. For our projects. And frankly, you'd be more comfortable in the guest suite." "Comfort," I said slowly, "isn't always found in square footage, Bree. Sometimes it's found in respect." She opened her mouth, then closed it. I walked past her, pulled out the manila envelope I'd prepared earlier. Set it on the counter between us. "What's this?" "Terms," I replied. "If you and Carter wish to remain here, under my roof, then you'll follow them." She reached for the envelope, but I stopped her. "Not yet." Read it with Carter. Discuss it like adults. And decide whether staying is more important than controlling. You can't just. I can, I said calmly, because I hold the deed. And starting tomorrow, I hold the keys. That night, I changed the locks. A locksmith named Jared came by just after dinner. Young, polite, didn't ask questions. I handed him a fresh batch of keys and a tip in cash. And when Bree came downstairs asking what was going on, I told her simply, everyone gets a copy. One per adult. No spares without written permission. You're serious, she whispered. I'm a homeowner, I replied. Of course I'm serious. For the first time, her eyes flashed with something I couldn't quite place. Not anger, not confusion, recognition. She was seeing me not as an aging placeholder, but as a force, as someone who remembered how to take up space. That night, I stood in the doorway of my bedroom, the master bedroom, and looked out over the garden I had built with my own hands. I saw the rose bushes I'd trimmed last spring, the stepping stones Theo helped lay. And I whispered to myself, not for the first time, you do not owe softness to those who mistake it for weakness. The house was silent after midnight, and in that silence, I heard something strange. A quiet knock. Not on the front door, on my bedroom door. I opened it and found Theo standing there, barefoot in his pajamas, holding a picture he'd drawn. Grandma, he said sleepily, can I sleep with you tonight? I looked at him, and for all the lines being redrawn, for all the cold negotiations and paper fences being built, this one small gesture reminded me why I stayed as long as I did. I knelt down and kissed the top of his head. Of course, sweetheart. Climb in. He curled into the blanket like a kitten, picture still in hand. I sat beside him until he drifted off. And I promised myself something as I watched him breathe. This house wasn't just mine. It was history. It was legacy. It was a lesson they were all about to learn. When I woke the next morning, Theo was still asleep beside me, his little hand curled around my wrist like he used to do when he was a toddler. For a few moments, I just lay there, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest, letting the stillness wrap around me. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I slipped out of bed gently, careful not to wake him, and padded into the kitchen. The sun was barely up, filtering through the window over the sink like warm honey. I brewed my coffee, strong, 2 sugars, splash of milk, and stood at the counter sipping slowly. Then I saw it. The manila envelope. Still sitting there where I'd left it unopened. Of course it was. Bree and Carter hadn't touched it. Because in their minds, none of this was real. They thought I was posturing. That eventually I'd soften. That I'd bend, like I always did. But I wasn't bending anymore. At 7:43 a.m., Carter came downstairs. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept. His hair was rumpled, shirt wrinkled, and he paused at the sight of me standing there in my robe like a sentinel. "Morning," he said cautiously. "Morning," I replied. He poured himself coffee, no milk, no sugar, and leaned against the fridge. I saw the envelope. Saw it, I repeated, but didn't read it. He winced. Bree thought maybe we could talk first, before anything gets official. It's already official, I said, calm as a lake. You live in my house, and that comes with rules now, written ones. Carter exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. We're not trying to be villains here, Ruth. Then stop acting like ones, I replied. He blinked. I'd never spoken to him like that before. But I wasn't speaking to the man who married my daughter. I was speaking to the man who sat silently while she tried to exile me to the back of my own land. I've given you both grace, I continued. Years of it. I cooked. I cleaned. I watched Theo. I paid bills when things were tight and never asked for thanks. But that ends now. We just thought it would be simpler. To make me small? He didn't respond. Across the kitchen, Theo's drawing from the night before was still on the counter. I picked it up. It was a house. My house. Drawn with shaky crayon lines and sunbeams shooting out of the roof. 3 stick figures stood in front. One with glasses and a bun me. Another, taller, holding a briefcase, Carter, I assumed. And a third Bree, maybe with bright yellow hair. But in the corner of the page was another stick figure. A tiny one. All alone. No label. No face. Do you know what this is? I asked, holding up the drawing. He looked at it. Shrugged. Theo's picture? It's a message, I said. He drew all of us. But he also drew someone left out. Alone. Small. Carter looked down at his coffee. I don't think he meant anything by it. No, I said. But that's the point. Children absorb what isn't said, what isn't done, what's left out. Silence. At 8:15, Bree came downstairs. She wore a sharp blazer and too much perfume. She greeted me with a tight-lipped smile that didn't touch her eyes.
Mom.
Carter says you're insisting on contracts now. I'm offering clarity, I said, pouring her a cup of coffee. Clarity tastes better than resentment. She ignored the cup and crossed her arms. We don't need formality between family. You made it formal when you tried to relocate me with a typed agreement. That wasn't about disrespect. Then what was it about, Bree? I asked, because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like eviction. Her jaw clenched. We just wanted boundaries. That's all. And I gave them to you. On paper. I pushed the envelope toward her again. This time, I didn't look away. She took it. Opened it.
Read.
Page after page, her expression shifted. From annoyance to disbelief to something close to guilt. The agreement was fair. They could stay. But rent would be due on the 1st. Utilities split. Groceries accounted for. And one clause they hadn't expected. The master bedroom remains with the owner. All guests, including family, are subject to guest terms unless otherwise negotiated. You're serious, she whispered. As a mortgage. Carter cleared his throat. We didn't mean to make you feel like a burden. You didn't make me feel like anything, I said. You just made it clear what I am when I stop giving. Silence again. Theo wandered in a few minutes later, hair a mess, eyes puffy. He yawned and tugged on Bree's sleeve. Mommy, can Grandma still read me the pancake story before bed? Bree looked at me. I met her gaze evenly. She knelt to hug Theo. Let's go get dressed, okay, buddy? After they left the kitchen, Carter stood up. You're not just doing this for yourself, are you? I looked at him. I'm doing it for the woman who gave without boundaries. She deserves better. And I'm doing it for the girl my daughter used to be, the one who once begged me to braid her hair before every big test. I want that girl to come back. Because I miss her. He didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded and walked out. That afternoon, I called the locksmith again. Asked him to install a secondary lock on the master bedroom. Just in case. Because some lines needed to be literal before they were respected. At 7:06 p.m., I found a note outside my bedroom door. We'll sign. But I need to talk first. Alone. Tomorrow morning.
Bree.
I folded the note. Slipped it into my pocket. And for the first time in months, I slept with the door locked and a smile on my face. Not because I didn't trust them. Because I finally trusted myself. Bree asked to talk alone. She said morning. So I waited. At exactly 7:59 a.m., she knocked on the sliding door of the sunroom like she used to when she was a teenager sneaking in late, trying not to wake her father. I didn't answer right away. I let her stand there, holding her oat milk latte in a compostable cup like a peace offering, eyes darting at the garden she once called quaint and now hadn't touched in years. When I opened the door, I didn't smile. Come in, I said. She stepped inside quietly. No heels this time. Just tennis shoes and an oversized cardigan. Her armor was soft today. I led her to the kitchen table. Mine, the real one, not the glossy formal set in the dining room no one ever used. The table where her science fair volcano had exploded. Where she first learned cursive. Where she once sobbed for an hour after her first breakup, curled in my lap while I ran fingers through her hair. Now she sat across from me, legs crossed, hands fidgeting in her lap. I read everything, she said, tapping the manila envelope still in her hand. I'm sure you did. I didn't expect it to feel so cold. I raised an eyebrow. Like the rental agreement you gave me? She winced. Okay. I deserved that. She looked down for a beat, then back up. You always had this way of doing things that made people feel safe. Even when things were hard. Even when we were broke or grieving or fighting. You never raised your voice. You just handled it. And maybe, I said softly, that's why you thought you could handle me. That hit her. She didn't speak for a moment. Just reached for her cup, took a slow sip. I'm not proud of what we did, Mom, she said. I think we told ourselves it was logical, sensible, a family discussion. But it wasn't. It was cruel, and condescending, and deeply unfair. Now I stayed silent. Not because I was punishing her. Because I needed to know if she could sit with the discomfort. If she could fill the silence on her own.
She did.
I've spent the past 2 nights wondering when I became this person. The woman who writes up an agreement to move her mother into a glorified shed. I raised my eyebrows slightly, waiting. She gave a sad laugh. I used to look up to you. I still do, I think. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as real. You became the default. The help. The person who always said yes. She looked at me, and her voice cracked. That isn't love. That's convenience. Now I reached across the table, just enough to set my hand near hers. Not touching, not yet. No one becomes cruel overnight, I said gently. It's a slow forgetting. You stopped asking me how I was. And I stopped remembering to tell you. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't want to be the daughter who forgets. I looked at her. You already were. She flinched, but I added, you don't have to stay that way. Tears spilled now. She didn't hide them. She just let them fall onto her latte lid like drops of apology. I'll sign, she said. The lease. The rules. All of it. You deserve to be respected. I deserve to be seen, I corrected. Yes, she said, nodding. That too. Then, after a long breath, she asked, do you still want us here? I looked out the window at the garden. The basil was starting to bolt. The hydrangeas were fading, but the soil still held promise. I want Theo to grow up knowing what stability feels like, I said. But I will not sacrifice my peace for anyone, not even family. I understand. I studied her carefully. I need to see the change, Bree, not just hear it. She nodded again. Okay. Before she left the room, she hesitated at the doorway. You said something yesterday, she said. About missing the girl I used to be. I waited. I think I miss her too, she whispered. And I think I want to find her again. She left the room. And I sat alone for a while, staring into my coffee. Not smiling, but not aching either. Just breathing. That afternoon, Theo and I planted lavender near the porch. He got dirt in his hair and on his shoes, and I didn't stop him. He kept asking questions like, do plants get sad when it rains too much? And if Grandma leaves, who will read me the funny voices in the bedtime books? And I just kept planting, one sprig at a time, answering each one with love disguised as calm. Later that night, I walked past Bree and Carter's bedroom. The door was cracked open. Inside, I saw them seated on the floor, papers spread between them, my agreement signed. A calculator. A pen. They were budgeting.
Together. Quiet.
Respectful. I said nothing. Just closed the hallway door behind me and returned to the sunroom. I lit the candle I used to only light for guests. I poured a glass of wine. And I pulled out a journal. One I hadn't touched in years. The cover was leather.
Worn.
Stamped with gold leaf that read, "Things worth keeping." I flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Today my daughter saw me again. Not as a burden, not as a backup, but as a woman with roots." And just before I went to bed, I placed a copy of the signed lease into the safe under my bed, along with the deed, along with my first paycheck stub from 1983 when I worked 2 jobs to keep this roof from leaking. Because some papers were more than paperwork. They were proof. There's a moment, just before dawn, where the world holds its breath. Not quite dark, not quite light, just stillness. Like the universe is waiting to see who wakes first. That morning it was me. I woke before Theo, before Bree or Carter stirred, and padded barefoot into the living room, wrapped in a knit shawl that still smelled faintly of jasmine and thyme. The air had a crispness to it, the kind that suggests change is finally seeping into the walls. I walked past the family gallery, portraits, vacations, milestones. Frames that lined the hallway like trophies of a life lived together. But one frame was crooked. Not broken. Not shattered. Just off. It was the photo from Bree's college graduation. She stood in cap and gown, arms wrapped around Carter and Theo, who had only been a year old at the time. But I wasn't in it. Not even in the background. I remembered the day clearly. I had helped steam her gown that morning. I held Theo through the entire ceremony so she could walk across the stage unburdened. I took the picture, in fact. The one now framed on the wall. But I wasn't in it. And that had become the story, hadn't it? I wasn't in the picture. I adjusted the frame slightly, no malice, no anger. Just alignment. Then I walked to the kitchen and made coffee. 1 cup. Just for me. At 9:03 a.m., Bree entered the kitchen, hair damp from a shower, a quiet expression on her face. Carter trailed behind her, offering a polite morning as he headed for the fridge. Bree lingered in the doorway. "You noticed the photo," she said softly. I nodded, not turning. "I didn't realize you weren't in it until last week," she continued. Theo found the negatives and asked why Grandma was always behind the camera. I stirred honey into my cup. "I used to think being behind the camera was my way of holding us together," I said. "But it also meant I disappeared from our story." "I'm sorry," she said. "You don't have to keep saying it," I replied, turning to her now. "You just have to remember it. The next time someone suggests I'm too much or in the way." She nodded. No defensiveness. Just listening. And that was new. That afternoon, I drove into town alone. I didn't say where I was going. I didn't need permission anymore. I stopped at an old shop on Mulberry Avenue. One of those cozy places that sells hand-woven throws, soy candles, and art prints with words like resilience etched in script. In the back corner, I found a small wooden frame. Oak. Weathered. Honest. I bought it without even knowing what I'd put in it. As I walked back to the car, I passed the community center bulletin board. A flyer caught my eye. Women Who Built U.S. Nominations now open. Celebrating women who've shaped generations in quiet ways. Something stirred in me. I took a photo of the flyer. I didn't think about nominating myself. But I did think about the women I'd known. The women who'd vanished into caretaking. My mother. My grandmother. A neighbor named Eleanor who used to leave casseroles on doorsteps without a name tag. When I got home, I found Theo in the garden. Dirt on his nose, trying to trap a snail with a cup. "Grandma," he beamed. "Did you know snails carry their whole house on their back?" "Smart little things," I said. "Do you think they get tired?" he asked. I crouched beside him, brushing hair from his forehead. "Sometimes," I said. "But I think they rest when they need to." He nodded, as if this were the most profound thing he'd ever heard. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the fence line, I printed an old photo. One Theo had drawn last year with crayons and glue. A family picture. This one had me in it. In the center, arms wide. I placed it in the new frame and set it on the fireplace mantel. Then I removed one of the professional photos, the ones where I wasn't included, and stored it in the drawer. That small change felt like a thunderclap in my chest. A reclamation. That night, during dinner, I spoke up without ceremony. "I've decided to write something," I said. Bree looked up. "A book?" "Not quite. A submission for the Women Who Built Us project." "That's wonderful," Carter offered. "About who?" I smiled. "Me." He blinked. Bree smiled slowly. "Good," she said. "I'd read that." Theo chimed in, chewing on a biscuit. "Will I be in it?" "You're one of the best chapters, baby." After dinner, Bree helped me do dishes. No protest. No performance. And then she asked, like she hadn't asked in years, "Is there anything you need, Mom?" I paused. Then answered honestly. "Time. Space. and to be remembered for more than what I provided. Bree nodded. I think I can do that. Later, when the house was quiet, I sat at my desk and opened a blank document. At the top, I wrote, "This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about remembering." And I kept writing until midnight, because it was time the woman behind the camera told the story in front of it. It started with a letter. Not a long one. Not dramatic. Just a folded sheet of parchment tucked into an envelope with the return address of Sable and Finch Law Offices. I found it on the kitchen counter after returning from the library, where I'd spent the morning typing pages for my submission to the Women Who Built Us project. Bree said it had come in that afternoon. Official looking, she'd added, her voice tight like a thread pulled too hard. I sat at the kitchen table, turned the envelope over once in my hand, then opened it. Inside was a single sentence on letterhead. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience regarding a matter related to the estate of Mr. Daniel Montgomery. I froze. Daniel Montgomery, my late husband. He'd been gone over 20 years. There were no loose ends. No debts. No forgotten assets. We'd sold his business, cleared everything, or so I thought. But now, apparently, something had resurfaced. Bree hovered in the hallway, watching. Everything okay? She asked. I nodded slowly. Just unexpected. I didn't say more. Not yet. Some truths are like bones. They need to be uncovered gently, piece by piece. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I pulled out the old lockbox from my closet. Inside were neatly stacked folders: Daniel's death certificate, old tax records, birth certificates, our marriage license. I hadn't looked at most of them in years. At the bottom was a yellowing envelope with Daniel's handwriting. In the event of questions. I'd never noticed it before. Or maybe I had and buried it. Hands trembling slightly, I opened it. Inside were photocopies of a document I didn't recognize. An old partnership agreement between Daniel and someone named Ernest Calloway. The name struck a faint bell. I vaguely remembered a quiet man who came to the funeral, said very little, dropped off a bottle of bourbon and a card, then vanished. On the back of the agreement was a note in Daniel's familiar scrawl. If you're reading this, then someone's come asking. I never told you because I didn't think it mattered after the sale. But Ernest made a promise. He said if anything ever came of the land behind the warehouse, half was still mine.
Ours.
I never filed it. I didn't think it meant anything. But if he kept that promise, it's yours now. Love you.
D.
I stared at the words for a long time. The land behind the warehouse? That warehouse had been sold off after his death. The land behind it had been worthless at the time. Old railroad tracks, overgrown brush. But I remembered now. Rumors that the city had approved redevelopment in that area, that a tech startup bought the site. If Ernest kept that promise, the next morning I called the law office. A woman named Karen Finch answered, her voice clipped and professional. Yes, Mrs. Montgomery, she said. Thank you for returning our call. I represent the estate of Mr. Ernest Calloway. My heart beat a little faster. He passed last month, she continued. And in his final instructions, he included a land transfer, citing your name specifically. He listed your husband as a silent co-owner in an informal partnership and left his remaining share in your name. I didn't speak. Are you aware the parcel is now valued at just under $780,000? She added, as if that were a casual aside. I closed my eyes. What do I need to do? I asked quietly. We'll prepare the documents. There are no disputes. He left everything clean. He wanted it to go to the person who never asked for anything but gave everything anyway. The room tilted slightly. I ended the call. I stood in the middle of my kitchen. Then I laughed. Not out of joy. Not even out of disbelief. Just a breathless, incredulous sound that came from deep in my chest. Daniel had left me a gift. Not money. Not land. Not even legacy. He'd left me something more powerful. A reminder that even in death, someone had still seen me. Later that night, I called Bree and Carter into the living room. They arrived looking half curious, half wary, like maybe I was going to renegotiate the lease or declare a new rule about refrigerator etiquette. Instead, I handed them a piece of paper. "The land your father once co-owned with a man named Ernest Calloway," I said. "It's now mine. Fully. Just transferred." Carter blinked. Bree looked up from the paper. "Wait, this says it's worth." "I know," I said. "I don't need you to read it aloud." Silence. Then Bree whispered, "Are you going to sell it?" I shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe I'll lease it to the Women's Center as expansion space. They need more room." Carter opened his mouth, then closed it. "But," I continued, "before I make that decision, I need you both to understand something." I sat down slowly, hands folded in my lap. "You tried to move me into a space I once used to store mothballs and paint cans. You tried to shrink me down, write me out. You didn't ask what I needed. You didn't care what I built. But here's the thing, life has a funny way of returning power to the people who lived without it the longest." Neither of them spoke. "And this house," I continued, "it's not your inheritance. It's my life's work. If you want a future with it, you'd better start acting like you respect the woman who built it." Then I stood and walked toward the hallway, pausing only once. "Also," I added over my shoulder, "the pantry's off limits to anyone who doesn't know how to label leftovers." The silence behind me was golden. Later, as I sat in the sunroom, Theo curled next to me with a comic book. He looked up. "Mom said you found treasure," he whispered. I smiled. "Sort of." "Is it gold?" "No," I said. "But it's shiny. In the soul kind of way." He seemed satisfied with that. And I realized something. This story, my story, it was never about the house. It was about the walls they tried to build around me. And the ones I quietly walked through, paper in hand, keys in pocket. There's something peculiar that happens when power shifts in a house. You can't always see it, but you can feel it. In the air, in the pauses between footsteps, in the way people start knocking on doors they used to barge through. By the end of that week, the silence in the house wasn't passive anymore. It was cautious, measured, respectful even. And it was the first time in a long while I realized I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of being ignored. But not anymore. That Sunday, I walked past the guest suite, the one Bree and Carter had so graciously tried to offer me weeks before. The door was open. A few boxes sat half unpacked. The old armoire was still covered with a sheet. I stood there for a minute, staring at it. This was the room they'd wanted to tuck me into like an afterthought. 4 beige walls and 1 dusty window. A manageable space, they called it. I stepped inside and let the silence speak. The air was musty. The carpet smelled like winter. The mattress was still wrapped in plastic. They hadn't touched it since I'd declined the offer. Good. It would remain unclaimed. Not as a symbol of resentment, but as a monument to what I would never settle for again. I closed the door and left it open just a crack. Let it be a reminder. Later that day, I received a phone call from the women who built us project. A woman named Simone spoke warmly, gently, like someone who knew how to talk to people who'd been overlooked too long. "Mrs. Montgomery," she said, "we received your submission. I just wanted you to know, it was one of the most powerful entries we've read this year." My heart thudded. "We'd like to invite you to speak at the awards ceremony next month. Just 5 minutes. A reflection on what it means to reclaim space." I blinked. "Me? Yes, you." I wasn't the kind of woman who usually stood behind podiums. I was the one who ironed the tablecloth for the person who did. But something inside me said, say yes. So I did. After I hung up, I sat in the sunroom with my tea, knees folded beneath me, and stared at the garden. The lavender Theo and I had planted was taking root, stubborn and fragrant. I thought of Daniel then. I imagined him standing at the edge of the garden, sleeves rolled, hands on his hips, grinning like he used to when something worked. "I hope you're watching," I whispered, because I was building again. That evening, I called a family meeting. Not out of tradition, out of necessity. We sat at the real table. The kitchen one. Not the dining room we used to reserve for show. Just the four of us. No phones. No distractions. I'm leaving town for a few days, I said plainly. Bree looked up, startled. Where? To Vermont. To see someone I once knew. Someone who reminded me who I was before I stopped asking. Carter blinked. Is everything okay? I'm not running away, I said. I'm walking toward something. Theo looked confused. Will you come back? I reached over and squeezed his hand. Of course. But when I come back, I want to see a house where people talk. Where needs are spoken, not assumed. Bree opened her mouth to speak, but I held up my hand. This isn't a punishment, I said. It's practice. For the life I'm choosing. Then I placed a folder on the table. Inside were instructions, utilities info, emergency contacts, a calendar of when I'd be gone. And a letter. Not for them.
For me.
Sealed in an envelope marked, to be opened if you forget who you are again. Bree stared at it for a moment. Then, very softly, she said, You're not the same woman who used to make excuses for everyone. I know, I said. And I think, she added, swallowing, I'm glad. That night, I packed lightly. Just a few clothes.
A book.
A notebook. And a copy of the land deed Daniel had quietly left for me. Because sometimes, a woman needs to carry proof with her, not for others. For herself. Before I zipped the bag, I placed one last thing inside, a photo.
Not of my family. Of me.
Standing in the garden, sleeves rolled up, hair in a clip, smiling at something just off camera. It had been taken by Theo last week, when I wasn't paying attention. I looked strong. Visible. Real. I slept peacefully that night. No creaking guilt. No dreams about shrinking to fit someone else's version of me. Just rest. And when I left the next morning, just as the sun rose over the rooftops, I didn't leave quietly. I closed the front door with intention. Like someone whose story no longer needed narration. The bus to Vermont rolled past quiet towns and rust-colored barns, the kind of countryside that looked like it belonged in someone else's story. I watched the landscape blur by through the window, my reflection hovering faintly in the glass, older, softer around the eyes, but sharper in spirit than I had felt in years. I didn't bring a phone charger. I didn't answer the texts that trickled in from Bree. Just checking in. Theo misses you. Can we talk when you're back? I wasn't ignoring her. I was reclaiming my silence. I arrived in a small town that smelled like wood smoke and fresh bread. There were wind chimes on nearly every porch. The air felt like something you could fold yourself into. The cab dropped me off at a white farmhouse tucked behind a line of birch trees. And there she was. Melanie, my sister, standing on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee and a look on her face like someone who'd been preparing for this moment for years without knowing what she'd say. We hadn't spoken in over a decade. Not since Mama's funeral. Even then, it was more nods than words. But now, there were no events to keep us civil. Just history. And the choice to pick up a thread we'd let fray. She walked toward me slowly, like one does when approaching a wounded animal. Or maybe she was the one afraid of getting bitten. I set down my bag. You look older. She laughed. You look like you finally stopped waiting for something. That caught me off guard. She hugged me, quick and tight. Not out of obligation, but recognition. We sat on the porch with a coffee. Neither of us touched it for a while. I read your submission, Melanie finally said. Simone from the project sent it to me. I guess she didn't realize we were related. I glanced at her. Did it surprise you? She nodded slowly. You were always the quiet one. The one who kept things from boiling over. I guess I didn't realize how much heat you were holding. That's the thing about women like us, I said. People only notice us when we explode. But by then, we've already burned through most of ourselves. She looked down at her hands. I'm sorry I didn't come after Daniel passed. I sipped my coffee. Bitter.
Honest.
I'm sorry I didn't ask you to. We didn't cry.
Not yet.
We just sat, letting the space between us warm up like winter soil waiting to bloom. That evening, Melanie showed me the guest room. A quilt Mama had made still hung on the wall. I ran my fingers across the stitching. One square had my name embroidered in uneven loops. The next morning, we made eggs and toast and talked about the kind of grief that calcifies when it's unspoken. About Mama, about Daniel, about ourselves. Melanie told me about her divorce, her goats, her writing group that met on Thursdays. I write poems now, she said, a little embarrassed. Bad ones, but it helps. Words don't have to be good, I replied. They just have to be honest.
She teared up at that.
Quietly, without fanfare. We took a walk that afternoon, down a winding path near the edge of her property. The trees were bare, but there were buds forming. Melanie stopped suddenly and pointed to a wooden bench nestled beside a small creek. I sit there when I forget who I am, she said. And just like that, I remembered. I used to have a place like that too. Before the house became a duty instead of a home. Before Bree's lists and Carter's requests and the soft erasure that came with being the helper. That night, we lit a fire in the hearth and opened a bottle of wine. We talked for hours. I think I forgot how to be a sister, I said softly. And I think I forgot how to be held accountable, she replied. We both laughed. And it didn't sound strained. It sounded like two women finding the thread again. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror and studied myself.
Lines, scars,
Silver strands. But also, eyes that didn't flinch anymore. I pulled out my journal and wrote, "Some parts of you can only return when you leave everything behind." I left to find quiet, but found myself instead. On my final day in Vermont, Melanie handed me a sealed envelope. "What's this?"
I asked.
"A poem," she said.
For you.
For the woman I forgot was more than just my little sister. I tucked it into my bag. When the cab arrived, she hugged me again. This time longer. This time not like someone trying to apologize for years, but like someone hoping for more to come. "I won't disappear again," she promised. "You don't have to," I said. "Just show up." I left Vermont with only one bag, but more of myself than I'd had in years. And when I arrived home 2 days later, the air in my house was different. Bree met me at the door. Not with questions. Not with guilt. But with something better. A folded paper. A drawing. It showed the same house as before, ours. But this time, in front of it, were 4 stick figures. The smallest one in the middle holding the other's hands. Above it, written in green crayon, "Home is Grandma." I didn't cry, but I folded the drawing carefully, and I walked past the guest suite, to the master bedroom, where I belonged. Home looked different after Vermont. Not in furniture, not in wallpaper, in stillness. There was less rustle, less tension pretending to be routine. The house had always been quiet, but now the silence felt full. Not of resentment, not of avoidance, of awareness. I unpacked slowly, deliberately. Theo trailed behind me like a shadow, bouncing on the edge of every room, chattering about his new drawing app, the lizard he named Butter, and how Bree had tried to make pancakes but burned them so badly he almost called the fire truck. I smiled and nodded and let him talk. He paused when I placed his green crayon drawing on the mantel, right where the graduation portrait used to be. He looked up. "You're putting it there?" I nodded. "It matters." He beamed. That evening, Bree knocked on my bedroom door, not tapping timidly like she had weeks ago, but firmly, clearly. I let her in. She stood in the doorway for a moment, eyes moving from the bookshelf to the vase of lavender now dried and bundled. "I cleaned out the storage room," she said. "The one behind the garage?" She nodded. "I found some of your old photo albums. The ones you thought were lost." My breath caught. "The green leather one?" Her eyes softened. "And the blue one with the silver clasp. They were in a box labeled seasonal decorations." Of course they were. I followed her to the kitchen where she'd stacked them neatly on the counter, dusted and polished. A cloth napkin rested underneath them like they were sacred. "Why now?" I asked gently. She hesitated, then said, "Because I realized something. You weren't asking for control, Mom. You were asking to be remembered." And I forgot. She didn't cry. Neither did I. Some acknowledgments don't need tears. Later that week, I stood in front of a room full of women. The Women Who Built Us awards were hosted in a modest community center with folding chairs, paper name tags, and a buffet of finger sandwiches that had probably sat too long under plastic wrap. But I'd never felt more seen. Simone introduced me with a smile. Our next speaker submitted not just a story, but a reclamation. A reminder that the quietest foundations hold the most weight. I walked up slowly, holding only one thing in my hand, a photo of me and Theo planting lavender. I didn't bring notes, just memory. "Good evening," I began, voice steady. I used to think that building a home meant keeping everyone else comfortable, and that if I did it well enough, I'd earn my place. I glanced at the women in the crowd, some holding babies, some clutching crumpled tissues, others with eyes that looked like mine used to.
Tired. Kind.
Overlooked. I was wrong. What I built mattered. But I forgot to include myself in the blueprint. A few nods. A few tears. I continued. We are told to be generous. Helpful.
Soft.
But not once are we told to ask for space, for voice, for rest. So we keep giving. Until one day we wake up and find ourselves standing in the home we built, wondering when we became a guest. The silence was thunderous. I lifted the photo. This is me and my grandson. He helped me plant a garden after I drew a boundary. He didn't see anger.
He saw roots.
Kids always see the truth first. A quiet laugh in the corner. I finished. I didn't tell this story for revenge. I told it so someone else would know they're allowed to take up space. That service isn't the only currency for love. That you deserve a room where no one expects you to vanish. Applause. Gentle at first, then rising. After the event, a woman about my age approached with tear-streaked cheeks. "My daughter just moved me into her garage," she said. "She said it's temporary. Thank you for reminding me that I don't have to accept that as my final chapter." I hugged her.
Tightly.
When I got home that night, Theo had left something on my bed. A folded card. Inside, in his scratchy handwriting, "You're the grandma that makes people brave. Love, T." I closed my eyes and let that settle into the parts of me that still remembered shrinking. The next morning, Bree made breakfast. Real pancakes. No smoke. She placed a plate in front of me. Syrup warm. Coffee fresh. "I used to think being a good daughter meant taking care of things," she said. "Now I think it might mean letting you tell me when you don't want to be taken care of." I nodded slowly. That's a good start. Theo, still chewing, asked, "Is Grandma moving out again?"
Bree looked at me.
I smiled.
No, sweetheart.
Grandma's moving in. It began the way all ordinary days do, quietly. A breeze pushing through the curtains. The kettle whistling softly. Theo humming from the living room as he built another Lego universe, without rules or limitations. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, the sunlight warming the oak through the window. My journal sat open beside me, a pen resting across the spine. I hadn't written yet, because I knew, somehow, this would be the last page of this chapter. The house no longer felt like a battlefield, no longer echoing with the guilt of unspoken expectations or the sharp clatter of crossed lines. It felt like mine again, and that meant I could choose when to let go. Bree entered quietly, still in her robe, her hair tied up in a messy knot. She sat across from me. No pretense this time, just presence. "You're up early," I said. She nodded. "I had a dream." "Good or bad?" "Honest." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "I was standing in the garden. Only it wasn't ours. It was your childhood home. And you were there. Younger. Maybe 30. Holding a rake and a piece of paper." I tilted my head. "A letter?" Bree nodded. "You told me I could either plant what I wanted or keep borrowing what you'd already grown. And then you handed me the rake and walked away." I smiled faintly. "Did you plant anything?" She hesitated.
No.
I just stood there.
That's all right, I said.
"That's where it starts." She reached across the table then, her fingers brushing mine. "I can't undo what I tried to make you accept. But I can stop trying to shape you into someone easier to manage." I didn't answer. I just held her hand. That was enough. Later that afternoon, I drove out to the edge of town, to the brownstone. Yes, the land Ernest left me had been sold, but I'd kept the house.
I hadn't told them that part.
The money from the land transfer had gone to the Women's Center, just as I'd planned. But the brownstone? It remained untouched.
Mine.
I unlocked the front door and stepped into stillness. The same shelves lined the walls. The same light poured through the stained glass window above the landing. The air smelled like lavender, old wood, and something deeper, possibility. I walked from room to room slowly, brushing the walls with my fingertips like they were the pages of a book I was rereading. In the kitchen, I set a single place at the table. Just one plate. One glass. A cloth napkin folded carefully. No expectation of guests. No script to follow. Just space for one woman to breathe. I made a pot of lentil soup, the kind Daniel used to love, and sat at the table with a slice of buttered bread. And I ate slowly, gratefully. And when I was finished, I washed my plate, dried it, and placed it back on the shelf. I stayed the night. In the morning, I pulled out my journal and wrote, "You can love people with your whole heart and still refuse to hand them the pen. You can offer shelter and still keep the deed. You can reclaim your seat at the table, even if you have to build the table from scratch." When I returned home 2 days later, the porch had been swept. A bouquet of wildflowers sat on the step with a note from Bree. "This house is ours, but it only stands because of you. Please don't ever feel like you have to leave to be seen." Inside, Theo had drawn another picture. This one was a table, not a house, not a garden. A long table with many chairs. But the biggest chair sat at the center, labeled Grandma's Seat. Above it, in big crooked letters, the heart of the house. I taped it to the refrigerator, right next to the rules for leftovers. That evening, I hosted dinner. Not out of obligation, out of choice. Lemon rosemary chicken, fresh greens from the garden. A blueberry tart that cracked a little down the center, imperfect, but mine. Bree lit the candles. Carter set the table. Theo poured the water and called it fancy juice.
We sat together.
Not as a family in repair, as a family in truth. And when they reached for seconds, they asked. When they cleared their plates, they thanked me. I didn't correct them. I didn't brush it off. I let the words land. After everyone went to bed, I stepped outside with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The garden swayed gently in the evening breeze. Some of the lavender had wilted. Some blossoms had already dried on the stem. But the roots? Still strong. Still mine. I looked up at the stars and thought of all the women I'd been. The mother. The wife. The caretaker.
The guest. And now?
I was the architect of the life I had left. Not loud. Not angry. Just undeniable. And tomorrow, I would begin writing my book. Not for revenge. Not even for legacy. But for the quiet women like me who set the table, filled every plate, and then sat on the edge hoping someone would hand them a fork. I'd write until they knew. They were always the feast. If this story moved you, take a moment to honor the quiet builders in your life. The ones who gave without asking and stayed without being seen. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that remind us the strongest roots grow in silence, but they hold up everything.